Have you ever had the strange feeling that someone was absolutely certain you would come back? Not hoping, not wondering, not even waiting. Certain. And then, you didn't. You didn't send the message. You didn't ask for another chance. You didn't show up at their door carrying your regret like a peace offering. You just stayed silent. And what fascinates me is that most people think the shock comes from rejection. It doesn't. The shock comes from expectation collapsing. If you've ever been on the receiving end of that situation, then stay with me for a minute. And if something in this conversation feels familiar, maybe subscribe. Not because I need another number on a screen, but because there are some truths people only discover when they're finally ready to hear them. Here's what most men never realize. When someone is convinced you'll chase them, they're not actually reacting to who you are. They're reacting to the version of you they've built in their mind. The predictable version. The one they think they understand. The one whose next move is already written. And maybe that's exactly who you used to be. Maybe every disagreement ended with you reaching out first. Maybe every period of distance ended with you breaking the silence. Maybe every mixed signal, every cold response, every emotional withdrawal eventually produced the same result. You came back. Again, and again, and again. Not because you were weak. Let's be honest, most of the time it wasn't weakness. It was attachment, hope, history. The belief that if you just explained yourself one more time, maybe they'd finally understand what you meant. Maybe they'd see how much you cared. Maybe things would return to what they were. But something changed. Not overnight, not dramatically. Most transformations never happen that way. Usually it's quieter. A man gets tired. Not angry, not bitter, just tired. Tired of conversations that go nowhere. Tired of proving intentions that were already obvious. Tired of feeling like his sincerity is being evaluated instead of appreciated. And one day he wakes up and realizes something uncomfortable. He's spending more energy trying to keep someone's attention than they spend trying to keep his. That's a painful realization, because it forces you to look at a possibility you've been avoiding. Maybe the connection wasn't being sustained by mutual effort. Maybe it was being sustained by your pursuit. There's a difference, a huge difference. One creates intimacy, the other creates dependence on a pattern. And patterns are dangerous because people start confusing them with certainty. Think about it. If every time someone pulls away, you move closer, what do they eventually learn? Not necessarily that you love them. They learn that distance brings you running. And once a pattern becomes predictable, people stop questioning whether it will happen again. They assume it will. That's why your silence feels so loud. Not because you're playing a game, not because you're trying to teach a lesson, but because for the first time, the script isn't unfolding the way they expected. The phone stays quiet. The notification never arrives. The emotional safety net they unconsciously counted on isn't there anymore. And suddenly they're left face to face with a question they never thought they'd have to ask. What if he actually meant it this time? That's where the real shock begins. Not when you leave, when they realize you're capable of staying gone. And if you've ever reached that point, you know something most people don't. Walking away is rarely the hardest part. The hardest part is resisting the urge to go back when nobody is stopping you. Because that's the moment you're no longer fighting another person. You're fighting the version of yourself that believed love had to be chased. And that battle is much deeper than most people are willing to admit. I want you to imagine something. It's late. The room is quiet. You're doing something completely ordinary. Making coffee, answering emails, watching something meaningless just to unwind. And somewhere, unexpectedly, a thought crosses your mind. They're probably wondering why I haven't reached out. Not because you're obsessed, not because you're secretly planning to, just because human beings notice unfinished stories. And that's what makes this so difficult. The people who are most shocked when you stop chasing are often the same people who believed they understood your emotional limits. They thought they knew exactly how long your silence could last. A day, maybe 3, a week at most. Then you'd return. You always did. What they never accounted for was growth. Because growth is invisible while it's happening. No dramatic soundtrack, no announcement, no public declaration. Just small moments that nobody sees. Moments where you almost send the message and don't. Moments where you reread an old conversation and close it. Moments where loneliness knocks on the door and you choose not to confuse loneliness with love. Those moments change people, quietly, permanently. And here's something I wish more men understood. When someone expects you to chase them, it doesn't automatically make them cruel. Life is more complicated than that. Sometimes people become accustomed to being pursued because that's the dynamic they've always experienced. Sometimes they mistake attention for stability. Sometimes they become so used to your emotional availability that they stop recognizing its value. Not out of malice, out of familiarity. Human beings are remarkably good at adapting to things they once appreciated. A compliment, a sacrifice, a kindness, a person, especially a person. The heart has a strange habit. It notices absence much faster than presence. And that's why your withdrawal creates confusion, because when you're always there, your presence becomes part of the background. Like air conditioning in summer. Nobody talks about it while it's working, they only notice when it stops. And then suddenly the room feels different. What fascinates me as a psychologist is that people often misinterpret this moment. They think the silence means they miss you. Sometimes they do, but sometimes what they miss is certainty. Those aren't always the same thing. Read that again in your mind. Sometimes people don't miss the person. They miss the predictability, the reassurance, the comfort of knowing someone is emotionally available whenever they decide to engage. And when that certainty disappears, it creates anxiety. Not necessarily because love vanished, because control vanished. And control is addictive, especially when we don't realize we have it. That's why some people become restless when you stop chasing. Not because they suddenly developed new feelings, because a familiar emotional structure collapsed. The dynamic changed, without permission, without warning, without negotiation. For the first time, they don't know what happens next, and uncertainty is uncomfortable, very uncomfortable. The irony is that you've probably lived inside that uncertainty for months, maybe years, wondering where you stood, wondering what they felt, wondering whether the effort was mutual, while they rested inside the confidence that you'd eventually return. But now, the positions have shifted. And something fascinating happens when they do. You begin to see the relationship more clearly, not through longing, not through hope, not through fantasy, through reality. You notice who reaches out, who stays silent, who becomes curious, who becomes defensive, who genuinely misses the connection, and who simply misses being chased. Those are two very different experiences. One is rooted in affection, the other is rooted in expectation. And expectation has a way of disguising itself as attachment until reality forces the mask to fall. That's why your silence reveals things words never could. Not because silence is powerful, but because it removes the distraction. When nobody is pursuing, nobody is performing. What's left is the truth. And the truth tends to make people uncomfortable long before it sets them free. There's another layer to this that almost nobody talks about, and honestly, it's the part that hurts the most. Because eventually, after enough time passes, you start seeing memories differently. Not the big memories, not the vacations, the laughter, the late-night conversations that felt endless. I'm talking about the small moments. The moments you ignored because you were too emotionally invested to examine them honestly. Maybe there was a conversation where you expressed something important and it was brushed aside. Maybe there was a time you needed reassurance and somehow you ended up comforting them instead. Maybe there were dozens of tiny situations where your effort was treated like a guarantee rather than a gift. At the time, you didn't call it imbalance. You called it understanding, patience, commitment, love. Because when a man cares deeply, he often gives people the benefit of the doubt long after the evidence starts pointing elsewhere. That's not stupidity, it's optimism. And optimism can be beautiful. But it can also keep someone standing at a closed door long after they've stopped hearing footsteps on the other side. I once worked with a man who said something I never forgot. He told me, "I kept thinking if I loved her correctly, she'd eventually choose me the way I was choosing her." That sentence stayed with me, because underneath it was a belief so many people carry without realizing it. The belief that effort creates reciprocity, that if you're loyal enough, patient enough, available enough, eventually the scales balance themselves. But relationships don't work that way. Human beings don't work that way. Affection isn't a reward system, and attention isn't a currency that guarantees emotional investment in return. Sometimes two people genuinely care about each other, and yet one person is carrying most of the emotional weight. Not intentionally, not maliciously, it's just happening. One person initiates, one person reassures, one person repairs, one person reaches, over and over, until eventually they become exhausted. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The exhaustion doesn't arrive all at once. It accumulates, like drops of water filling a glass. A disappointment here, a dismissal there, a forgotten effort, an unanswered vulnerability, a conversation that somehow leaves you feeling more alone than before it started. Tiny things, almost invisible individually, but together, they become impossible to ignore. Then one day something surprising happens. Nothing. That's the surprising part. No dramatic argument, no explosion, no final speech, no revenge. The man simply stops. And from the outside, it looks sudden. People say things like, "Why did he change? Why is he acting different? Where did this come from?" But it didn't come from nowhere. It came from 1,000 moments nobody was paying attention to, including him, especially him. Because sometimes the last person to recognize emotional burnout is the person experiencing it. He's too busy trying to save the connection, too busy believing the next conversation will fix everything, too busy remembering who the other person can be when things are good. And that's another reason people become shocked when you stop chasing. They're comparing your current behavior to the version of you that tolerated everything, the version that stayed, the version that kept reaching, the version that absorbed disappointment and called it patience. But people don't remain the same forever. Eventually reality catches up. Eventually self-respect catches up. Eventually the heart asks a question it can no longer avoid. If my absence doesn't matter, why am I working so hard to maintain my presence? That's not bitterness, that's clarity, painful clarity, the kind that arrives quietly and changes everything. Because once a man truly sees the dynamic for what it is, he can never completely unsee it. And that realization is often far more powerful than any goodbye he could ever say. What surprises most men isn't that someone expected them to chase, it's how strange they feel once they finally stop. Nobody talks enough about that part. Everyone focuses on the other person's reaction, the confusion, the shock, the sudden curiosity. But very few people discuss what happens inside you. Because at first it doesn't feel empowering, it feels wrong. Almost unnaturally wrong. You wake up and instinctively reach for your phone. You think of something you would normally send them, a joke, a song, a random observation from your day, and then you remember. You don't do that anymore. And for a few seconds, there's an emptiness. Not because you're making a mistake, because habits leave echoes, especially emotional habits. For a long time, part of your identity may have been tied to being the one who reached out, the one who repaired tension, the one who carried conversations back to life, the one who refused to let things end. When you stop doing those things, you aren't just losing a routine, you're losing a role. And losing a role can feel like losing a piece of yourself, even when that role was exhausting. This is where many men become vulnerable to an old temptation. Not love, not connection, familiarity. There's a difference, a very important difference. Familiarity feels safe because it requires no adjustment, no uncertainty, no learning, no grieving. You already know the pattern. You already know the emotional script. You already know how the story usually unfolds. And when life feels lonely, the familiar can start looking beautiful, even when it wasn't making you happy. That's one of the mind's most convincing illusions. It edits memories. It softens sharp edges. It highlights the good moments while quietly removing the reasons you left. Suddenly, you're remembering their smile, but not the confusion. You're remembering the chemistry, but not the imbalance. You're remembering who they were on their best days, while forgetting how often you survived their worst ones. And this is where many people return, not because the situation improved, because nostalgia became louder than reality. I've seen this happen countless times. A man starts healing, starts rebuilding his confidence, starts creating a life that no longer revolves around someone else's attention. Then a message arrives. Simple, unexpected, maybe even innocent. And suddenly emotions he thought were gone come rushing back. Not because they're new, because they were never fully processed. That's why emotional growth isn't about pretending you don't care. It isn't about becoming cold, or detached, or indifferent. Real growth is much less dramatic. It's being honest with yourself when your emotions start rewriting history. It's recognizing the difference between missing someone and missing a version of yourself that existed around them. Those aren't always the same thing. Sometimes what you miss isn't the person, it's the hope, the possibility, the future you imagined, the story you wanted. And letting go of a story can feel just as painful as letting go of a person. Maybe more painful, because stories don't have flaws, reality does. That's why the silence continues to matter. Not because it's punishing anyone, not because it's proving a point, but because for the first time in a very long time, you're giving yourself enough distance to see clearly. And clarity can be uncomfortable. It can feel lonely. It can feel unfair. But clarity has something fantasy never does. It tells the truth, even when the truth hurts, especially when the truth hurts. And once you begin choosing truth over fantasy, something unexpected starts happening. You stop asking why they were shocked, and you start asking a much more important question. Why were you willing to chase for so long in the first place? And that question, the one most men spend years avoiding, changes everything. Why were you willing to chase for so long? Not why you cared. Caring is easy to understand. When someone touches your heart, of course you care. When you build memories together, of course it's hard to let go. When you've invested time, emotion, energy, and hope, of course part of you wants the story to work. That's human. I'm not talking about caring, I'm talking about chasing, because they're not the same thing. One comes from connection, the other often comes from fear. And fear is clever. It rarely introduces itself honestly. It doesn't say, "You're afraid of being forgotten." It says, "Send one more message." It doesn't say, "You're afraid this ending will hurt." It says, "Maybe there's still a misunderstanding." It doesn't say, "You're struggling to accept reality." It says, "Just try a little harder." That's why so many intelligent, self-aware men remain trapped in cycles they can clearly see. The issue isn't a lack of understanding. The issue is emotional resistance. Part of them still hopes effort can change an outcome that's already revealing itself. And hope, when disconnected from reality, can become a very painful place to live. Because it keeps your eyes fixed on what could happen instead of what is happening. But eventually something shifts. Not because another person changes, because you do. You begin noticing something that was hidden underneath all the chasing. You begin noticing yourself, your needs, your standards, your exhaustion, your worth. And for many men, that's unfamiliar territory. They've spent so much time studying someone else's behavior that they've never really examined their own. They know every signal, every mood, every inconsistency, every possibility. Yet they haven't asked themselves a simple question. What kind of relationship am I actually trying to build? Not what kind of relationship you're trying to save, build. Because those are different conversations. A relationship worth building doesn't require one person to constantly prove their value. It doesn't survive solely because one person refuses to stop trying. It isn't held together by anxiety, confusion, or emotional overfunctioning. It grows because two people are participating, not perfectly, but willingly. And once you experience that kind of reciprocity, something remarkable happens. The desire to chase begins fading on its own. Not because you've become stronger, because you've become clearer. You no longer mistake uncertainty for depth. You no longer mistake effort for compatibility. You no longer mistake emotional hunger for love. And suddenly, the people who expected endless pursuit seem less mysterious. You understand what happened. You understand why they were shocked. You understand why your silence felt different this time. But more importantly, you understand why you couldn't keep being the same person. The old version of you believed that if you cared enough, stayed long enough, explained enough, sacrificed enough, Eventually, things would become mutual. The version sitting here now knows something deeper. Mutuality isn't something you earn, it's something you recognize. And the moment you recognize its absence, your choices begin changing. Quietly, gradually, honestly. That's why the most powerful thing about not chasing isn't that someone else notices, it's that you notice. You notice how much energy you've been spending. You notice how much peace you've been postponing. You notice how often you've been abandoning yourself while trying not to lose someone else. And that realization can be heartbreaking, but it can also be freeing. Because one day you'll look back at the silence that felt so difficult to maintain, the silence that made them confused, the silence that made them shocked, the silence that forced you to confront yourself. And you'll realize it wasn't the end of your story. It was the moment your story finally stopped revolving around someone who expected you to chase, and started revolving around someone much more important, you. So tonight, before you close this video, ask yourself one honest question. If they never reach out, if they never explain, if they never give you the closure you hoped for, what would your life look like if you stopped waiting anyway? Sit with that question, don't rush it, because the answer might be the beginning of a completely different future. And sometimes, the most life-changing step a man takes isn't moving toward someone, it's finally stopping long enough to move back toward himself.